spirituality, religion at its heart is a way of responding to this great question of life. What matters? What is of true and lasting importance? How do we live our lives? Why do we live our lives? How do we live our lives in a meaningful way together? Obviously, there are always going to be, and there are today, a fantastic variety of different emphases and practices, different responses to that question, different ways of being religious and spiritual humans. And I think something genuinely new and exciting is happening today that I would like to talk about. But the core response, the heart of any religion, of any response to this urgent and impossible question of what matters, is that it does matter, that life is meaningful, that it matters. Every detail in every life is important. This kind of swooning affirmation and appreciation of life, this being in love with all that life is in the wonderful and the difficult, this spark that we find in the simplest moments of our lives, in the water that we drink and the way that we care for those that we love and for our family, in the choices that we make as people, in the mistakes that we make and how we atone for them, in every act of love and of hatred in our lives. This is the future, as it is the past, as it is the present of spirituality and of religion. How it is that we share a beer with each other at the corner or send memes to our friends. Everything else that I'm going to talk about stems from this and comes back to it. And if it doesn't, I don't think it's actually worth it. This sense of coming to and living as this sacredness in the core of your very being, this vital and vulnerable and precious and yet entirely ordinary and inviolable and indestructible sense of being alive. Everything else is just a riff on this, or a communication, a way of communicating, of saying to you that this is available, that this can wake up as the very core of your own self and heart, this unbearable beauty of life and death, of our parents and our children, of our friends and our enemies and our lovers. This is all available. It's all here now. And anything that I'm saying is offered in service of this waking up as you and as us. Obviously, I mean something quite broad by spirituality and by religion. I don't want to use these words in the sense that we tend to use them as being a kind of domain or activity in life, as something that happens in a church on a Sundays, but as something that is basic to a society and to life. That there is no society without religion, that there is no life without spirituality. It's how we make meaning and sense in our lives. The sacred, not as an experience of the sacred, but as that which we judge everything else by. That which is non-optional in life. We have a religion today, we have many religions today, but we have a religion today of personal impulse and consumer choice, right? Whether your sense of the sacred, what you must return to, what is non-optional in your life, is a morning prayer or a meditation practice, or watching Netflix or YouTube at the end of the night. Spirituality is this sense of the non-optional. It's the way that you are motivated to make the decisions in your life. And religion, in one way of thinking it, is the way that we codify this and ritualize this together. This is not just semantic. I'm suggesting not that religion is the ultimate domain of human life. I'm suggesting that it's a way of looking at the whole of life. And I think that this opens up, particularly in this talk, interesting insights that are going to be helpful. So in this domain of spirituality, something new and exciting is happening today, and I use the word integral for that. I'm obviously not the only person to use that word in that way, but I do use it that way, and I'm going to talk about it like a jewel. And like a jewel, there are many facets to it, there are many faces, and each face is a part of the jewel and all of the jewel at the same time. They're not really separable from each other. I think perhaps in this metaphor, integral is the light that reveals all these different faces and the color and the saturation, the hue of the jewel, something like that. But in this metaphor, the facets that I'm going to be returning to, that I'm going to be exploring as I riff through them, are that I believe any worthwhile spirituality in the future, any integral spirituality, is awakening based. is intersubjective, is between us, is active and practical, is soulful, recognizing the individual, but also incarnational, is a translineage religion and spirituality, is tantric in orientation, is imaginal and constructive, is view-based, is evolutionary and teleological without being directional, is educational, and finally is creative, is world constitutive, is world creative. Each and all of these are reflected in each other, and yet in some sense they're each necessary, meaning they don't reduce to each other. I find it necessary at least to touch on all of these. And of course, I don't pretend that this is a complete articulation. This is my creative articulation at this time, what it is that I felt was relevant and important as I was musing on this question. So if this jewel itself is anything, I think it's integral. And what that means, I think, has a couple of important elements to it. First of all, consciousness evolves. This is important. It's foundational. It's not really the focus of this talk. So to oversimplify that a little bit, how the mind works, the way that the mind organizes reality meaningfully, what is real and what is important, has evolved over time. And that evolution is not just a superficial change like you would see between different cultures today, nor is it merely reducible to biological evolution. There's been a structural evolution of the mind. In that evolution, we are transitioning out of a way of being called mental. In the words of philosopher of consciousness, Jean Gebser, who is also the reason that I use integral in the way that I do, and I think the person who uses integral in the closest way, or in a way that is closest to what it is that I mean by it. So this is all very hard to see and to talk about, because some of our most basic notions of what is real and what it is that we are experiencing, how in a fundamental way we generate or construct or interpret experience, how we make sense of our lives, is a reflection or a product of this mental, this evolutionarily prior way of being. Without trying to nail exactly what it is that nails down, or that means, what I intend by that, because everything that it is that I'm going to be talking about, I think, is struck through with this sense of what integral is. Instead of trying to define it beforehand, I hope that it will be illustrated, even in a practical and sometimes concrete way, as I continue the development of these themes. But the place to start, or one thing that is necessary, or I think essential for talking about all of this, is what I call interpenetrating conceptuality, which is a fancy way of just saying a kind of a both-and way of orienting to the world and to thought. This is another oversimplification, but mental consciousness is essentially an either-or consciousness. It's constrained, it's defined by the way that it divides reality up into conceptual dualities. Integral is more of a both-and consciousness, and not about superficial things like, do I want iced tea or lemonade at lunch? Oh, why don't I have an Arnold Palmer, which for those of you who are not Americans is lemonade and iced tea together. But a both-and consciousness at this fundamental operation, at this fundamental level of how it is that we organize reality. So I'll give an example that I think is very relevant today. Technology and natural biology. The difference for a mental consciousness, the difference between what is technological and what is natural is a basic one. It's real. It's a real one to mental consciousness. With integral consciousness, we see essentially that the distinction isn't real in any final way. We can use it. It might be helpful in certain circumstances or to reveal certain patterns of being, but it isn't real as such. So in this discussion where, is AI a danger to humanity, to human life? Is it dangerous to human life and Earth? There's this basic notion that often comes out that us and our technology, that humanity or nature and technology are somehow different, somehow separate, which is reminiscent of the nature versus nurture debate in psychology. That debate didn't resolve because one of those categories won. The debate is irrelevant because largely, at least, we're not thinking of it in the way that we used to. It's much more complex than that idea of one or the other being determinative. It's nature and nurture, and Sometimes, in some ways, it's important to talk about how one's environment conditions who one is, and sometimes it's important to talk about how one's genetic makeup determines how one is. And sometimes it's important to talk about, how one's environment and genetic background interact to make up who and how one is, but none of them are finally real. And the difference, the versus in nature versus nurture, is a way of talking about things. It's a way of making distinctions. Integral, of course, includes this sense of versus. It includes this sense of being able to make distinctions and take actions that divide and that separate, but in a way that is recognized transparently as an activity, not something that is merely the way that things are. So in this discussion about whether AI is dangerous to our future, it's not as if recognizing that we and our technology, are inseparable from each other means that we can't recognize that a future that looks like, the Terminator movies is a preferable future, is a future that we want to go towards. So it's not, this both and is not a kind of all is just one in a sort of loosey-goosey way. So that brings us back to the exposition of these themes. And we'll start again with awakening, which for our purposes today is something like being deeply at home in life, of being free, of life itself being worthwhile, being good in a way that is obvious and natural. The recognition that one's very being, is consciousness, is awareness, and that one's self is not limited to the psychological self, to the ego. Awakening is also not just a personal phenomenon. Our relationships, our culture can wake up, meaning that a future spirituality is going to be intersubjective. It's going to be between people. And I mean that not just in a way that is engaged in community or engaged in culture, but where the relationship itself, where the culture itself is waking up. There's one other important element to intersubjectivity, I think, which is where a lot of meaning, where any sense of purpose or of motivation is sourced in. I believe in integral spirituality is grounded and nourished and given its reason for being in this inherent basic care, this sense of meaning, which is inextricable from the reality of the other, from the you, from the thou. And this word care really brings us into this third theme, which is awakening to being as a self and relationship is not separate from the environment, from the world around us. It's an active and engaged spirituality. It's one that reveals itself not just in our day-to-day actions or what we choose to try and bring about in the world around us, but also in the grandest meta-systems of economy and global governance. It's in everything that we do and produce as human life and human being. I think if we get these three right, if we get awakening and intersubjectivity and activity right, everything else that I'm going to say follows from this. Perhaps they are the three largest faces or facets on this jewel. Though I'll add another one because sometimes intersubjectivity seems to mean the abrogation of individuality or a preference for the collective over the individuality. I don't mean that, but I will also include soul or soulfulness in these sort of introductory ones. Soulfulness here, there's a couple of different things, but basically means the sacredness of the individual, the importance of the individual life, not just the collective life, not just the collective or the community. So let's go into the deeper riff here. Awakening is not just a mystical possibility or this increasingly scientifically validated experience. I think there's a normative aspect to this. There's a normative possibility, meaning more and more, this can be normal. There's an aspirational basis for what it means to be a healthy, mature, adult human being. In the same sense that the narrow band of consciousness that we prefer in our society, adult waking consciousness, has not always been the way that people have been, and even today is not something that children are born into. You have to achieve an ego. You have to accomplish a normal, adult waking consciousness. I think that we can say that it doesn't make much sense to think of this as being the end of the road, or the culmination of maturity, and that we can affirm the ego and its place in our psychological development, and in the evolutionary history of our species, and say that awakening, that being, that the self with a capital S, the expression of the self with a capital S, is in some senses preferable, deeper, more meaningful, and possible for a large number of people, much more than we tend to be. It's not some special experience out there or over there, but more and more, I think, can become a kind of public experience. This brings us into a view-based notion of what spiritual practice is. Awakening is not a state. It's not an experience. It's a condition of experiencing. In mental consciousness, we generate an identity largely by selecting between experiences, by trying to avoid certain experiences, and by reaching for others. We generate a sense of self by projecting this self out into the future, by imagining and moving towards a kind of future where we get what we want, where everything is good, and avoiding the worst possible experiences. When you practice spirituality as if you're reaching towards some perfect fucking incredible moment that you experience awakening to be, or enlightenment to be, you're pushing off of something that is present now in reality. You're denying reality and experience in this moment. You're saying that something about being right now is not awake, is not good enough. Something about me is not good enough in what can be extremely subtle and very ingrained habits of mind and consciousness. Buddhism and modern neuroscience both say this preferencing, this valencing of experience as being good and desirable or bad and undesirable happens at a really foundational pre-conscious level of our experiencing. So this is why in the Tibetan Buddhism is where I get the word view from, and I'm particularly influenced by the Arrow Buddhists. But this notion is present across Tibetan Buddhisms. And this notion of view is also a little different in Tibetan Buddhism than how it's used in other Buddhisms. But in Tibetan Buddhism, you have this notion that the view and the practice and the fruit, or the view and the meditation and the action, that all of these are actually contained in view. That view is this central practice, and it's the outcome of practice. This doesn't mean that nothing happens or is experienced in linear time, but it means that the relationship between our identities, that what we are and what we take ourselves to be, and our experience, is almost reversed, or it's inside out and upside down. Rather than practicing to bring about a state, which is important. It's important to train the mind. It's important to engage with practice, but ultimately, at least at a certain point of practice, at a certain place within your own ego development, you can't get any further by trying to. So a view is a way of relating to experience, not trying to bring about or generate a particular experience. I believe that any future spirituality is going to be a view-based practice, religion, because some of what we have to embrace in relationship to the nature of our being and what is real and knowable, and these deep philosophical questions, has to be starting from a very different initial condition. That opens up or leads into something that I call state savviness. So if we recognize that awakening is not a state, it's not an experience to be had by a self, this allows us to start decoupling the value that we have, the overvalue that we have in certain modes and states of consciousness, and validate others which are de-emphasized by our cultures and traditions without getting too attached to any of them. They're all part of their stew. They have their place in the fullness of human expression. So things like psychedelics and other substances that alter consciousness, both in a temporary, but also a permanent way, right? A mushroom trip can change your life, not just give you an interesting time-bound experience for a couple of hours on a Saturday. These are all welcome. But awakening is at the core of this. Otherwise, you're going to be state chasing. And that state chasing, that looking for experience, for another experience, necessarily is bound to, because it is an expression of a particular way of organizing time and reality. States are useful, exogenous states are useful, endogenous states are useful, states brought about by substances, states brought about by practices, states brought about naturally and spontaneously. They're all useful. Awakening, in my sense, includes these apperceptions, these recognitions of a being that is free of time, of a being that is free of experience and perception even. Without this as a recognition, at the very basis of who it is that you take yourself to be, you're going to be making the confusion of who it is that you are, of yourself, by something that is conditional and that is bound in time merely or only. This is a good place, I think, to start bringing in intersubjectivity, the relational and communal aspect of this, because in a practice of deliberately inquiring into the nature of consciousness together, we start to touch in on a very different view of what is happening here, something that is quite different and quite foreign to what we take to be real. With awakening, we're recognizing that what we are is not contained, is not bound within the boundaries of our psychological self or of our body. We are not a separate being inside of this world. We are being in this world, including our bodies and psychological selves. Our experience, in an important way, is inside of us, is inside of awareness. When we start bringing this into practice with each other, we can find the relationship waking up in a very similar way to finding our own individual consciousness waking up. Something which is very different than a relationship between like two awakened but conceptually separate beings. What does this look like? Well, we start to notice the interpenetrative nature between what I am as awareness and experience, what you are, and what we are. That what I am experiencing right now is me, and that my awareness, my subjectivity is mine, is something inviolably separate and different from you, and that what I'm experiencing right now is you, not just affected by you, but in this very moment is a product of you. And further, that what I am experiencing is us, is something which emerges out of us, out of our being. And the same is true for you in the reciprocal. This opens up a direct realization that the being that we are, the awareness that we share together, is all of this at once and none of this. That it is you without me without you and me and us and none of that, and that these are all simultaneously present and accessible without being in any way, shape, or form ultimate or contradictory. This is a kind of guru practice, but one where the roles are interpenetrative, where I am guru and you are guru and we are guru and reality is guru and nothing is guru all at once. I think that this is constitutive of an integral spirituality, and you can say that this reveals the interdependencies in these concepts. You could say that intersubjectivity helps us notice interpenetrating conceptuality, or you could say that interpenetrating conceptuality reveals intersubjectivity. Those are both true enough. But I don't think that you have an integral religion. I don't think that you have an integral spirituality without some kind of practice of intersubjective awareness and awakening. Now, I've been speaking about this as if you were in a practice with somebody else, but I take this to be true of any kind of relationship and any form of relationship among two or any number of people. That's where the depth of this view, I think, really comes into recognition. And that's true not only among equals, but in this sort of great nesting of being and consciousness, which is cosmic. But you can sense into the realizations of realizing this, or the implications of realizing this, not just as an idea, but again as something equally as obvious, as perceivable as that you have a hand at the moment, or something as obvious as our current and more modern assumption that I am different from you, that I am separate, and that I'm also not at the same time one with you. Of course, it's very important to speak as if we are different from each other and to act as if we are different from each other, not only in a practical way. If you step on my foot, I'm going to say you are stepping on my foot, but in the psychological way. It's important to suss out, what am I doing and what are you doing and how is that different? Otherwise, we're not making an integral move. We are retreating into merging, and we're retreating into codependence. But it is possible to be all of this at once, to be an individual with boundaries, and to be the relationship, and to be just being. In a sense, that's always what's happening anyways. But just as with awakening, the recognition that this has always been the case, that the noticing, the seeing, the realization that this has always been the case makes a difference. It's meaningful. It changes what we take as being real and what we can do together. So this brings us into the sense of soulfulness, which I used to mean a couple of related things. There's a sense of the sacredness of the individual and a sense of of incarnational spirituality. So for the sacredness of the individual, in this intersubjective sense, if we are merely submitting our individuality, our individual will to the greater good, to God or to society, I think we're missing the point. I am different. I'm not reducible to my society or to the rest of being or my environment. And this uniqueness of a self, this autonomy and this self-determination, even if the ego is illusory and we are not finally separate, this sense of self and self-determination is necessary. Without this notion, without recognizing the sovereignty of each individual, I think we fall into some really seductive but ultimately unhelpful and dangerous traps that are rampant, not only in spiritual communities, but in society at large. The not recognizing the reality of the other and the sacredness of their own being and subjectivity is what allows for exploitation and the assertion of the will over. It allows for my good at the expense of your good, of my culture's good at the expense of your culture's good. It allows us to, pack 25 to 40 children into a schoolroom and tell them what it is that they should be doing and how it is that they should be being. Recognizing the reality, the sacredness of the individual means acknowledging the sacredness of the other, that we can't just determine meaning or meaningfulness for another being. We'll never be inside of the subjective experience of another being. And bringing relationship into this discussion includes always this unknowable otherness. This situates individual awakening in a way that both includes the other. Everything in this universe is me, is my being, and it's all awake. It all shares the same quality of luminous awakeness, and allows for the kind of freedom of the other, for the sacredness of the other's being, and the subjectivity and uniqueness of another. I think we see people who wake up to their own identity as being can fall into this spiritually narcissistic trap by recognizing the conceptual interpenetration of you and I and we and everything else. I think it corrects for that. It allows that, yeah, you are the being that is everything, but so is the one that's sitting across from you. Not only do you have a right to your experience and to your construction of self and consciousness, but so do I. And we touch on this ability to recognize and to affirm the reality of the other, no matter where they're coming from. Every other's reality is real. Their being is valid. There's a profundity of empathy in this view that goes beyond merely feeling what another person is feeling. Or even recognizing the validity of the worldview of the other. And if it's just me, if we have awakening without this recognition of intersubjectivity, and this happens, then these experiences of being awake, because they're so compelling and can seem so different from waking adult consciousness, if we enter into these experiences without the sense of the interpenetration of what I am and what you are and what we are and what is not any of us, without the sense of interpenetration of dream and reality, for example, of I and the other, then this might just seem like a dream. Then we get into this sort of solipsistic spiritual narcissism, and I can just act like a giant asshole in the world because it doesn't mean anything. The depth of expression of this, I think, is something along the lines of my will be thy will, where the alignment of the individual in this greater sense of purpose, not in a way that how I think we tend to be afraid of this reflexively, at least in the West, of the breaking of the individual will on the will of society, or for the greater good, or the will of God in some way, in the way that we find at the end of 1984 when Winston Smith loves Big Brother. This alignment of individual will with the will of the divine, or the will of the great other, or the will of reality, or whatever it is a kind of coming to something that is deeply true in the nature of our own will and sovereignty, and finding that it is and was and it always will be an expression of the will of the whole, of the will of the divine. This is a very different possibility for the relationship between what it is that I am, between my individual reality and between reality as such, reality with a capital R, a reality that is experienced inside of me, that is only me and not another, that is not merely defined in or by my society, but is also defined against my society. All of these are all present internally, all at the same time. This sense of expression, of expressing this internal reality, brings us to what an incarnational spirituality is, something that I think the embodiment movement is pointing towards, but that it doesn't quite reach, where the body-mind is a kind of instrument of expression, of creativity, not just for the psychological self, but for life itself, for consciousness, or for spirit, for actively making the world beautiful. So I think this includes the notion explicitly, this incarnational spirituality includes this notion of being in, of indwelling as the body, of being in touch with experience and sensation as a body, and using the full spectrum of the body's ability to move and to express in a way that is nonetheless related to or greater than just being in the purposes of the psychological self or for the body-mind. By waking the body up in this way, you're waking up the essential interface of reality, which is an interface that is not between two different things, but is an expression of life and matter, or of spirit and matter, or of the future and the present, is an expressiveness that is inclusive of all of these different dualities. This expression of will, this sense of purpose and meaning, again, not as something to be achieved or located ultimately in the future or in the world around us, the achievement of some goal or the creation of some becoming, but as a living sense of purpose, a living meaningfulness that walks and talks as our body-mind and as our bodily being, not as an end in itself, but in service to what is good, what is true, what is beautiful. This is not a vision of spirituality that is not merely transcendent, but nor does it deny transcendence. It's not merely immanent and in the body in this sense, but it doesn't deny the body or seek to overcome the limits of being a fleshy self. This sense of expressivity, that's not a word, this sense of expressiveness brings us into activity and creativity. And an integral spirituality finds itself and knows itself in the actions, in the processes that make this world up. Not just in the sense of being an activist, but in the sense that care, that love is a verb. And it's one that is the warp and weft of everything, from the way that we decorate our homes and bodies, to the food that we cook for each other, to our massive meta-systems of economy and exchange. It is active also in the sense of being practical and practice-oriented. It must be done. You must come to the edge of your being and discover what it is that is there. It's a bloody spirituality. It is full-hearted and passionate, and it's engaged in this production of truth and beauty and goodness, not just in the abstract, but in this sense of inquiring into and developing, debating, dialoguing, discovering truth and art and care. And that activity, again, is just as true in how it is that you set your dining room up as it is in how you create the conditions in governance in macro economies for the flourishing of all of life. That brings us to teleology, which just means, the ends of things, the means of things, or the goals of things, not the means of things. So why do anything at all? What's the motivation? What's the purpose behind this? I'm saying that an integral spirituality is teleological, that it aims at something but it's not an aim that is at some metaphysical attainment or some moment in time. It's not eschatological, which I think I'm pronouncing correctly, or I hope I am, which means, it's not aiming at the end of time in God, in the disillusion into God's glory, or ending in the Pure Land, or in some grand experience, or in death. The orientation, the direction of this moment, the trajectory of this soul and this life is a kind of judgment. It's a kind of discernment towards what is good and good and true and beautiful. Something which is experienced as the implicit in this moment. It's not in some future linear moment in time, and this keeps us, in this interpenetrating conceptual way. It keeps us able to be present without the attachment to some imagined completion in some future moment, while nonetheless being oriented practically in the world, while taking action to shape and to change and to make the world, to bring things about which do not exist and which we deem to be good, to be worthy of our time and energy and life and love. The notion of time I keep hinting on or touching on, I think, is equally important and is woven into what an integral consciousness is, where time is not thought of or experienced as being linear or as being causal only, nor is it only cyclical or simply non-existent. All of these kinds of time and more, they're all present and they're all simultaneous here. They're all available notions of time. We can say that we are here with this soulful trajectory of life, this implicit possibility or purpose or design even of what it is that we can become, along with the unknowable and emergent now, where things are genuinely new and genuinely unpredictable and undesignable and not merely predetermined, where habit and creativity and destiny and free will and predetermination are all interpenetrative. They're only contradictory in the mental sense. They're not contradictory in an integral consciousness. So this soulfulness includes this kind of creative coming into being in this way. The intensity of this brings us to the sense of the tantric facet of integral spirituality. So Tantra, the way that I'm using it here, is something like being able to face, to experience these extremely intense experiences that are the seams of our identity with awakeness. To face the ways in which we separate what life and death is, what any of these fundamental polarities, dualities of concept are, these boundaries, these intensities, these aspects of our reality which are so intense that we've traditionally called them deities. They have a being that is more than mortal, and that is transpersonal, that is greater than the human. This is where the link to what Tantra traditionally is in how I use this word. The working with, the inhabiting, the becoming the deity is a part of every traditional Tantra. It's part of what that word means. And working with these experiences, not only the intense experiences of the sexual body, but with wrath and with death and with overwhelming love as deities, as divinities. The integrations of these kinds of polarities that I'm talking about, these ultimate dualities, these ones of life and of death and of authority and service and of you and me and of agency and community, of autonomy and culture, of action and reception, being able to incarnate as a being, as an articulation of the freedom of expression of these fundamental energies of life. There's an extraordinary intensity in that, and it comes partially because these poles, these conceptual dualities, are never just in the mind. They're not mental categories alone. They're deeply held in the body and in the way that we act with each other, the way that we organize life and society. The way that we conceptualize what is good and what is bad, what is dark and what is light, is always in the body. It's not just some conceptual barrier that we have to work through. It's how we define our very own being, and that definition, that psychosocial definition of self, is literally a life and death matter. Our survival as beings hinges on the way that we map the world with these dualities. So to come to the place where that map is being drawn, to come to the place where we are creating those very seams in and as bodily beings, is extremely intense. And yet, if we don't learn how to wield these energies, how to embrace and incorporate our deepest fears and loves and desires and wraths, they will consume us. To me, this is something, or points to something like post-egoic shadow work, without which I don't think one can really transform beyond the duality of ego reactivity and awakening. I don't think it's possible to evince integral consciousness without this. So it's tantric in the sense also of being neither gradual nor sudden, but a kind of embrace of the view that the sudden path is and brings about, and a further embrace of all of embodied life and experience as the path beyond awakening, marrying the pathless path, the gateless gate, that which must always already be the case, with the development of greater and greater facility and mastery of the self, of the mind, and the activities of life. Not a mastery that is a mastery over, but a mastery from within, where these experiences are embraced not for their destination, not to get to some other experience, but as the path themselves. That's sort of my structural deep definition of what Tantra is, working with these intense primal affects and experiences and energies as awakeness, something which enhances awakeness, which allows us to remain as this awakeness, even in the most intense experiences in life, and which then allows us to enter even deeper intensities. I'm going to bring in the last three facets quickly because I'm starting to crescendo here. So education. I believe in integral spirituality is educational, and education is a word that I use like religion or like spirituality. It's another one of these terms that I think is a kind of expression of the whole of human life. Integral spirituality is educational in the sense of avowedly being about the learning and the creative discovery of what it is to be alive and human, and the transmission and the renewal, the reinvention of this across a culture in time, horizontally, and through cultures, through time, in a generational or a vertical sense. And integral spirituality is a translineage spirituality. It is includes the recognition of how necessary the spaces, the bounds of different practices, of different lineages are, and yet that no one approach, no one system, no one culture of spirituality or of religion could be final, either in the sense of being best in all cases, in all conditions, or most true, when what is true is always inexpressible and new and developing, and when we recognize just how unique we are as individuals, and that no one practice or system of practice is appropriate or effective for everyone. The working with, the working with and through how we articulate our concepts of reality, how we code them in practice as creative expressions of our deepest intuitions of what is good and valuable, finds expression as our lineages, as ways of transmitting and passing these practices and activities of human being, again, across culture, but also through time to the next generation. Particularly in religion, but I also mean lineage in a more broad sense, including culture. Our lineages are ways of educating, of determining what correct practice is, of helping us learn and grow into adequate human beings. We're sitting on millennia of human knowledge here. We're not going to scrap that, but lineage has and needs limits. Reality is not contained within a lineage, and when we recognize this, lineage is open to its own expression as being a creative style of being, one that allows for and constrains certain possibilities of human being. Where we see this as something transparent, as something that is active, we discover the value of a translineage spirituality, one that not only affirms different lineages and the intercourse between them as embodied, as incarnated in real human beings and communities, but where this possibility exists for any lineage to be a transparently evolving and developing translineage itself, a lineage which reveres and revels in expressing and exploring different and not necessarily commensurate ways of being reality, where these deep and fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality that we code and generate in lineage intersect and interact. This is a very interesting and fecund space to watch in the future, I believe. When we talk about these mental dualities as being the core of how we make sense of our world, when we recognize religion and spirituality as being these meaning regulatory and sense regulatory functions of human society, a translineage orientation becomes increasingly necessary, because as you, as an individual, are more and more willing to bracket your own assumptions while you're developing that self-reflexivity about the ways in which you are active in creating your own sense of what is real, your own response to these questions of what is of ultimate importance, to bracket the assumptions that compose your worldview, an intersubjective for the individual and a translineage practice is necessary to help surface the depth of those assumptions, just how deep that activity of world making and of reality generating goes. You will never see your blind spots, and a lineage will have its blind spots, which it also can't see. And then finally, the last facet here is that it's imaginal. I think that's largely implicit in what it is that I've been saying. But when we're orienting even to what is real and what is illusory in this interpenetrating way, we find a place beyond the dichotomy of direct experience and imagination, of real and imaginary, where it's acknowledged that this imaginal capacity is in everything in our human lives, where life is neither real nor illusory, but the marriage of these in our reality generation and creation, something that honors, that recognizes the role of imagination, of fantasy, of dream in the generation of a world. So this touches, again, this brings up the active nature of all of this. It lights up this intersubjectivity, this translineage notion of this. You can't do this alone, or you're going to go off of the rails. No group that is not composed of individuals who are drawing upon a wide variety of paths and approaches to the human organism and organizing is going to be able to avoid the massive pitfalls of this sheer amount of energy. But imagine a room of masters of different paths, drawing from lineages from all over the map of the domains of human knowledge production and practice, all engaged together, all willing to drop the structures that have liberated each other to meet in this naked moment of being, not as a master and a student, not as reciprocal master-students, but as consciousness, constantly and riotously in love with its own discovery, in love with itself and with the other. You need to develop all of these different themes to start to see the threads of this coming together, I think, necessarily. We can start to mix and match and really riff, having all of this on the table. When we hold this tantric notion up, this internality and embrace of the intensity of life, to the notion of all times and all kinds of time as being simultaneously present, we recognize this future is inside of us and is possible. This experience that we are moving towards is here, as is the experience of the garden, of the time before time, as is the trauma of leaving that, of becoming an individual self. We can experience all of this as being here, and intersubjectively, we can be this for and with each other. We can, because we already do. We can embody, for example, the basic, fundamental, impossibly intense animal terrors for each other, and enter that fear so fully that it's no longer seen as being something other, as being outside. We can incorporate, we can become consciously that fear. And this opens up a tremendous kind of freedom of expression, something which allows us to wield, to become these energies, so we're not merely pushing off of them and constraining the possibilities of this life with what we will not allow to be, what we will not allow ourselves to be. These constraints, they're going to be individual, they're going to be collective at the same time. My particular fears, how I place them on you, is going to be different from your particular fears and how you place them on somebody else. But that fear is human, and without incorporating that fear, we're unable to exist beyond it, to imagine and to become a world which is not driven by that fear. So again, I'm just using fear as one particular expression of these primal intensities. These intensities that we discover when we dare to engage our fullness with each other, when we reach to incarnate our souls in this life, to become what it is that we can be. We have power so deeply in the shadows, power with a capital P. We've put it there so deeply in the shadows that we only allow it for people who don't have empathy, which is absurd and dangerous. what would it be like if we didn't shy away from an expression of our own authority, not in minor ways or in ways that are acceptable or in ways that retract it and say, oh, everything will work out because everything is divine, but from sitting in the fullness of this kind of authority of our own being? What if we didn't shy away from this kind of power as a community where we're exploring and expressing that power, where we are acting as a check on each other's power, as a practice of power, not to create a kind of identity of authority or of being powerful, but to step into a kind of sufficiency or worthiness of creating the world, of making reality? What does authority look like? What is spiritual authority when it is interpenetrative in this way, when it's engaged in a translineage and an intersubjective culture? I don't think that this is the end of the hero, the end of the individual. I think it looks like an educational culture of heroes, where the notion of the boundary of the community, of the bounded nature of a community, is flipped, is turned inside out and upside down, where we are each individually our own lineage, our own center of human being, where my talents and gifts and life circumstances and history of practice and of experience could not be yours, and yet are in relationship with you and yours and they and theirs in a way that keeps any one individual or practice or community, that keeps these bounded entities whose boundaries are only creative from becoming final or ultimate. This is a culture of masters with a relaxed and deep enough mastery to allow others to be masters and to desire to enter into this challenge to mastery. What does it mean to wield power with empathy? How do we heal our deeply damaged relationship with power and authority inside and outside and between us, so that this is possible, so that we may take up this responsibility and make reality? If there's one thing at the heart of this, really at the heart of this, it's this word creative. All of this that I'm talking about is reality generative. We get to create this reality, not from the outside in some cold and distant way as an impersonal designer, but from the inside, like surfing. We fashion this future by caring enough to dare to bring it forward, to assert it, to trust so deeply in this life as to be able to drop it, to be powerful together. This is a vision of dropping this duality of peace and fight and struggle and action at every scale, not only conceptually, but in our direct perception and experience and action. It's a vision of standing for what we know to be true while being willing and desiring even for what we know to be true, to be constantly in revision, to dare to be right and to be wrong, to be an inquiry. Inquiry is another word that I could have used as a facet here. I kind of roll it into conceptual interpenetration. I don't think that they're easily separable, but inquiry here means being willing to assert symbolic truths, to discover our own implicit truths, the ways in which we condition our reality as minds and souls, while constantly reaching for beliefs, communications, ways of being, statements, symbols for actions and environments of greater and greater expression of what is always non-symbolic and inexpressible, of what is so immanent that it is obvious and yet so transcendent that it is unapproachable. To be willing to say the fucking thing and to do it, to be a statement without hesitation and a questioning without end at the same time. Can we fight for what we believe while deeply honoring each other, while constantly checking and discovering what notions we are attached to, while releasing those particular symbolic forms that we're wedded to, that we're using to cover up and deny our own fears and deficiencies, and to protect us from our own overwhelming experiences? To be willing to enter into this depth of unknowing with each other, to let go and directly and immediately let go of what we have assumed was real and true, to be willing to put all of it on the table, to bracket it all out, and still to honor what is real in our experience, to assert our interpretation as happening, as being an aspect of reality, without defending it as being true. If there is one word that comes closest to the totality of all of this, the jewel and the light shining through and revealing it, it might be creativity. Creativity as genius, as generousness, generativity, as making what is implicit real in this world in the most concrete of ways, of generating reality consciously, making what is possible actual and tangible. Having set all of these themes up, obviously, I think I could riff on them for hours. I find the corner cases and the nuances and the thin tails and the reflections on reality and our current ways of being and what it is that is possible to be as a human being, as a culture, as a society. I find this endlessly fascinating, but I hope that this, at the very least, conveys some of the flavor of what it is that I'm talking about and why I think any desirable, worthwhile, sufficient future spirituality will be integral. Thank you for engaging.